There's an especially poignant section in the film American Radical when a young girl starts weeping as she talks about your comments about the Holocaust. Could you discuss, please, your response to that whole realm?
Well, first of all, I didn't see the film, but I do know that particular segment because it kind of went viral on the YouTube, on the internet. There's a bit of a misunderstanding about that segment. Everybody assumes, because they didn't listen closely, they assume that the girl was Jewish, but she's not Jewish. If you listen closely to what she said my remarks were, she began by saying, offensive to Germans. She's German. She's not Jewish. And I found it extremely offensive because, as I told her, but it wasn't in the film, as I told her, I think you're a little bit confused, young lady. It's your parents who murdered my parents. So don't lecture me on how to speak about the Nazi Holocaust. The Germans have this kind of breastbeating theatric. It's their passion play now to show how pained and anguished they are about the Nazi Holocaust. I would be very happy if it were authentic, but it's not authentic at all. It's just a theater. And so I was resentful at her telling me, you know, I lived with my parents' horrors for their entire life, and for nearly my whole life, except for the last 15 years. Nobody's going to tell me about when it is and when it's not apt to invoke the memory of or make analogies with the Nazi Holocaust.
Why have so many people in the Jewish community been so active in the idea of universality in the context of the American Civil Rights Movement, but so many reverse position when it comes to Israel, wherein Jewish particularity and so forth is heralded as an important moral virtue?
I think that's a good question. I think the answer is people learn to live with contradictions, and Jews have been able to live with the contradiction that in the United States they demand strict separation of church and state, and they demand full equality under the law, but they don't see a contradiction between that and supporting the idea of a state that belongs to a particular ethnic group and in which other non-members of the group are at best given a second-class status and ultimately are transmitted the message that they don't belong and that they should leave. Now, how Jews reconcile that, as I said, we all know people learn to live with contradictions between what they avow and how they act. Here it's slightly different because it's not just a contradiction between what they avow and how they act. It's a contradiction between two sets of avowals. The demand for full equality under the law here and the, in effect, demand for a state which denies full equality there.
Okay. In your view, is there a strong component of Jewish religious values, the chosen people, nation apart, all that stuff, invested in modern secular Zionism, per the arguments of people like Israel Shahak and Joel Kovel? What's your perspective on that?
I'm not sure of the question. You have to explain it.
The chosen people, the nation apart idea, the Jewish religious history, does that actually inform modern Zionist worldview?
I'm not religious, and I can't speak in any authoritative way to the religious texts. I suppose, you know, Judaism has been adapted by many, not adopted, adapted by many Jews in such a way as to confirm what has been and can't be denied a remarkable success story of modern Jewry, whether you look at things like the number of Nobel laureates who are Jewish, or the positions of power and privilege that Jews occupy in, say, American society. So there is a sense among Jews that we are special. It's not a sense that just derives from abstract notions or religion. It's a sense that derives from remarkable secular worldly success. And then when you have this remarkable secular worldly success, then you begin to find notions in the Jewish religion which confirm that success, namely, chosen people, nation apart, the whole world is jealous of us, they envy us, if they criticize us, it can't be because we're doing something wrong, they're criticizing us from jealousy and envy. And so I think it's a kind of reciprocal effect where there are elements in the Jewish religion which confirm this notion of chosenness, but on the other hand, there is this worldly success of Jews which then points the eye towards those elements of religion which validate the specialness of Jews, things like chosenness. And I think in a lot of cases, it's not the religion. Most Jews are secular, overwhelmingly. It's simply a sense of superiority that derives from what Jews seem to believe is the objective facts, that Jews are by far and away the most wealthy ethnic group in the United States, and the level of success is quite extraordinary.
Okay. How was the Holocaust used, in your view, as a political tool, vis-a-vis Israel and so forth?
Well, basically, the way the Nazi Holocaust is used is to say that Jews suffered uniquely during the Nazi Holocaust, what's sometimes called the uniqueness doctrine, that is, that never before in the history of humanity has any ethnic group suffered the way Jews suffered. And because Jews have suffered uniquely, then they shouldn't be held to the same ordinary moral and legal standards as anybody else, because excuse me, because their suffering was unique. And so then, if you say Israel has committed X crime or Y crime or Z crime against the Palestinians or against neighboring Arab states, then we're told, remember the Holocaust. Remember that special suffering which should grant us a pass.
You, in the Holocaust Industry book, you note there are two central dogmas. I mean, many things, of course, but one is what you alluded to: the Holocaust marks a categorical, unique historical event, and the Holocaust marks the climax of an irrational, eternal, Gentile hatred of Jews. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, well, basically the way the Nazi Holocaust is conceived, it's conceived as the climax of a millennial hatred of Jews by non-Jews. And, obviously there's elements of truth to that, as there's generally elements of truth to most, even the most erratic ideologies. There's elements of truth, and there's an element of truth to that. The thing is, Nazi ideology was a synthesis of many strands. So, for example, if you're insistent on the fact that the Nazi Holocaust was the climax or culmination of a millennial anti-Semitism, you can't explain why the first victims of Hitler's final solution were handicapped people and cripples. That doesn't make sense. If you look at the typical histories of the Nazi Holocaust, they begin with the fact that around 1938, 39, Hitler begins to implement this program to kill off people with the Nazis called, who had defects. It was called, they used the expression, a life not worth living. Well, if you situate the Nazi Holocaust strictly and narrowly in the framework of, or in the trajectory of anti-Semitism, that doesn't make sense. or if you situate the Nazi Holocaust strictly and narrowly in the question of anti-Semitism, then why were gypsies targeted? Why was he intent, or the Nazis, he in particular, intent on wiping out the Polish population? The framework of a millennial anti-Semitism explains some things about the Nazi Holocaust, but it doesn't explain everything.
Could you address, please, the issue of censorial kind of censorship and so forth in academia? You've faced it quite a bit, and a lot of other people who are in the ballpark of your argument face all kinds of academic intimidation. Could you elaborate on all that, what's going on in academia?
First of all, I don't think it's entirely true to say that a lot of people faced what I did. To my knowledge, I was the only one denied tenure. There was another case, had nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. The other well-known academic freedom case was Ward Churchill, but it was an altogether different issue with Churchill. To my knowledge, I was the only one denied tenure, and in general, academia is pretty accommodating for dissenting points of view. Well, the reason a vendetta was launched against me was not because of my point of view. From the point of view of academia, I'm actually quite mild, and I don't mean that rhetorically, I mean it literally. A lot of academics advocate what's called a one-state solution for the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm pretty conventional, 2 states. A lot of academics will attempt to justify using some form of jargon, postmodern jargon or something. Will try to justify things like terrorism. I don't. So I'm pretty tame if you look at my actual political positions. What caused the furor, in my opinion, was that I'm an activist, that I was actually having an impact on some, not a lot, obviously, I'm one person, but I was having an impact on public opinion. I was pretty effective at what I was doing. And so they were determined to stop me because, unlike most academics, I didn't confine my involvement to academic conferences and academic journals, wine and cheese parties. No, I was and am. I'm out there and trying to reach public opinion, and so I needed to be stopped. But if I were just espousing my ideas in the most narrow conception of academic freedom, namely the right to express your point, they wouldn't have cared.
Okay. Could you discuss Elie Wiesel, his influence in what you call the Holocaust industry?
Elie Wiesel, he kind of embodies the whole ideology of the Holocaust, this notion of the uniqueness of Jewish suffering, the mystification of the Nazi Holocaust that can't be understood. Obviously, at some level, any human experience you can't understand. It's true, until my parents passed away, I wouldn't have known what death felt like. And I've never been a parent, and I'm sure a parent will tell you, you don't know what it's like to have your child. At some level, every experience is beyond human grasp. But on the other hand, at some level, every experience is within the grasp of reason and rationality, as I said, within limits. But of course, in the case of the Nazi Holocaust, it becomes, this is uniquely inaccessible to reason. It's what the University of Chicago sociologist Peter Novick, he said that Wiesel had turned the Nazi Holocaust into a mystery religion. And I think that's correct.
Okay. Could you discuss, please, how the charge of anti-Semitism and Jewish self-hatred, all those things are used sort of politically in silencing dissent?
Well, basically, if you can't answer an argument, you change the subject. And in the case of the Nazi Holocaust, you try to discredit the messenger because you can't answer the message. And so everybody who criticizes Israel rather than deal with the criticism itself, you make the allegation or you level the charge that the messenger is an anti-Semite. It's becoming more and more ineffective as a weapon because, first of all, it's more ineffective as a weapon because of overuse, charging everyone, and now it's a large number of people who are critical of Israel. But more importantly, it's become ineffective as a weapon because it's being used more against mainstream people, people who are known. So when you attack this fellow who's nobody's ever heard of, named Norman Finkelstein, and saying he's an anti-Semite, people are willing to believe it because they don't know who I am. But then when you start calling Jimmy Carter an anti-Semite, it's something very different, because Jimmy Carter is a well-known quantity in American life, and he's established, at least since his presidency, a pretty impressive record of devotion to causes of human rights and human decency. And so when you charge him with being an anti-Semite, it loses its credibility. And of course it reached its ultimate absurdity. It's, as they say, reductio ad absurdum, when they start to charge Richard Goldstone with being an anti-Semite. He was a very respected international jurist from South Africa who investigated Israeli conduct during the invasion of Gaza, and he reached the conclusion that Israel had committed quite significant war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. And so it started to be said that Goldstone was an anti-Semite. The problem is Goldstone is Jewish, a practicing Jew, and he's also, as by his own reckoning, he's a very committed Zionist.
Could I ask you this? How do you understand the semantic issues involving in the naming of your and other people's ideological enemy? Meaning, is it Zionists? Is it Jewish Zionists? Is it the organized Jewish community? There's a lot of argument, and at risk of being called an anti-Semite always is a subtext to that. Could you discuss that?
I don't find these terms very useful. You know, I wrote my doctoral dissertation in the theory of Zionism, and I can say with a reasonable amount of confidence that virtually nobody who hurls around the epithet Zionist or anti-Zionist, or they know what it is. I wouldn't call it a complex ideology. It doesn't require a degree in particle physics to understand it. But on the other hand, it does have a intellectual content. But it doesn't mean anything nowadays. It's just an epithet. You don't like somebody, they're a Zionist, you know. I don't think it's useful. I think it's useful to stick to language and categories which everybody understands. Israel violates human rights. Israel is guilty of aggression. The conventional language of our day, the conventional language in our day is the language of human rights and international law. And I think you can say everything in that language, the language of human rights and international law, that you can say using epithets like Zionist.
Okay. What you mentioned in the book, Holocaust Industry, systematic institutional bias that exists out there per the subject of Israel and so forth. So who is that? Where does it come from? Why is it so widespread in modern society?
I think there are a number of reasons. The first reason is Israel serves U.S. interests, so just like the U.S. government gets a free pass in the American media, it would be unsurprising if Israel didn't also get a free pass, because Israel serves U.S. interests. It's the same reason that Egypt gets a free pass in the American media. I mean, people think here Egypt is a democracy. I mean, Egypt has had emergency laws in effect nonstop since Sadat's assassination in 1981, I guess. And Sadat has been the president for life, you know, no different than Duvalier in Haiti. But Egypt gets a free pass, you know. When Obama goes to speak to the Arab Muslim world, where does he go? He goes to Cairo. And it doesn't say anything about the government under which whose invitation he's accepted. And then the second reason is, it's true, no reason to be in denial of it. The Jews occupy a prominent place in the media and publishing in Hollywood, the arts, and that has an influence. I mean, it would be remarkable if there weren't an influence. When I was growing up, and you watched film and you watched the arts, you would think that the whole history of the United States was written by the whole history of the United States, actually the whole history of the world, was made by white males. And why is that? Why? Because white males control everything in the United States. So obviously they're going to depict a history which is very flattering to them. And so if Jews occupy a prominent place in the arts, it's unsurprising that they would convey an image that was flattering to Jews. That doesn't really surprise me. It would be surprising if it were different.
Could you discuss the Anti-Defamation League? You're on one of their official watch list and so forth. What is it? What function does it serve? What are its goals? What does it become?
The Anti-Defamation League, its main function is to defame people who criticize Israel. That's their job, and they've been like that. They like to play the anti-Semitism card, so already beginning in the mid-1970s, when criticism of Israel began, wasn't yet prominent, but it began in the mid-1970s, they began to put out these publications periodically, claiming that there was a new anti-Semitism. So in 1974, the head of the ADL, Arnold Forster and his partner Benjamin Epstein, they put out a book called The New Anti-Semitism. Then 1981, the Perlmutters, Nathan and Ruth Perlmutter, Perlmutter was the head of the ADL then, put out a book called The Real Anti-Semitism. Then Abraham Foxman puts out a book, the current head of the ADL puts out a book called Never Again, The New Anti-Semitism. They use the charge of anti-Semitism as a means of deflecting criticism of Israel. And they have a peculiar knack for defaming those who are critical of Israel, including myself.
Okay. How do you react to the charge that your research and books are gifts to anti-Semites?
It's a fact that anything you write can be used by other people in nefarious ways. That's just part of the nature of writing. And then you have to do an on-balance reckoning. You have to ask yourself, is that danger of such a magnitude such that you shouldn't criticize at all at this particular moment or ever? I don't think Jews are in a particularly precarious situation in the United States now. There's no danger of an outbreak of homicidal anti-Semitism. Their position is quite strong in the United States, and therefore it shouldn't be a deterrent, to speak frankly and honestly, especially when crimes of a significant magnitude are taking place. You know, you could say talking about slavery is going to contribute to hatred of Southern whites. So should we not talk about the history of slavery? No, you say, well, Southern whites are doing okay. They can handle a little bit of criticism about their past. So I don't think, there are times when, yes, I think you should reserve judgment. You know, if I were in Nazi Germany, for example, and I were a scientist, I don't think it would be appropriate in Nazi Germany, if I were a scientist, to try to do some research on whether or not there is a gene in Jews for craftiness or cheapness. No, I don't think that would be appropriate under those circumstances. And you'd have to question the motives of a person who would undertake that research project at that particular moment. But I don't think under these circumstances, I remember Raoul Hilberg, the great historian of the Nazi Holocaust, and he had defended me in a lot of the things I was saying. And Hilberg was asked the same thing. And he said, well, because he was asked about the things I was saying in connection with what was then West Germany. He said, I think the German Republic, its democracy, it's strong enough that it could withstand, the kinds of criticisms Finkelstein is making.
In 2004, there was a new position created in the State Department called the Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism. Do you have any knowledge about this or any perspective on what that is? And
it's just nothing. It's just a bone that's thrown to the Jewish community. The head of it, his name is Greg. I can't remember. I know the guy. He was involved in the shakedown of the Swiss banks during the Holocaust. Industries, extraction of monies from Europe. He's a complete imbecile. He's incapable of putting together an English sentence. And so I was actually quite happy when he was appointed to the post. Now they have somebody new, a woman, I forgot her name. These are just things that are thrown to the Jewish community. So whoever is the current head of state, when it comes to trying to get money.
In the Holocaust industry, John Murray Cudahy's exasperation, you have a citation from him. It's sort of a riddle about anti-Semitism. Do you recall this? Or should
No, I knew Cudahy. He taught at Hunter College. He's a smart guy.
So essentially, what he says, the quote you use is, not only does anything Jews do or refrain from doing have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but any attempt to explain anti-Semitism by referring to the Jewish contribution to anti-Semitism is itself an instance of anti-Semitism. Could you elaborate on the implications of that, where that goes?
Well, basically Cudahy was saying that it's normal that in most cases you would look for some aspect of a person's conduct to explain why there is an animus or a love towards that person. If people love a person, presumably it's because, at least in part, there are some actions of that person which would command admiration and, in fact, love. And if a person or persons are hated, it's normal to assume that there's some action or actions in that part of that person that would invite or provoke hatred. Doesn't mean that's the full story, but it's certainly an area of inquiry, a useful area and a rational area of inquiry. And Cudahy was saying that perfectly rational, normal area of inquiry, it becomes impossible when it comes to anti-Semitism. So you take a case like today, Israel commits many abominable acts. Israel calls itself the state of the Jewish people. So it would be perfectly reasonable for many, say, Palestinians to hate Jews because Israel claims to be acting in the name of Jews. So each abomination that they commit is being done in the name of the Jewish people. So it would be perfectly rational for a Palestinian to infer from these facts that there's something evil about Jews, and they become anti-Semitic. Now that's a reasonable explanation of why many Palestinians might not like Jews. And what Cudahy is saying is, you're not allowed to find a rational explanation having to do with Jewish conduct, that's prohibited. Whereas if you think through along those lines, it's perfectly sensible. I mean, the amazing thing about Palestinians is how many don't feel a hatred of Jews.
You say in the book, quote, the most successful ethnic group in the United States has acquired victim status. Could you discuss that?
Yeah, well, it's a paradox that even though Jews have done remarkably well in the United States, as I said earlier, an amazing success story. Notwithstanding that success, Jews still have in the United States and cultivate the status of being victims. And that is, on its surface, it would seem to be paradoxical, given the kinds of success that Jews have enjoyed in the United States.
What has been the mainstream media reaction to your books?
Basically, the mainstream reaction is there are no books. They haven't been reviewed. The only one that was really reviewed was the Holocaust Industry, and that's because it created a sensation in Europe, so it became slightly embarrassing to not comment on it in the United States. It sold quite a large number of copies and was on the bestseller list in many European countries for quite a long time. And so at a certain point, it appeared to be censorship not to review the book. So it was reviewed, and it was reviewed very harshly.
I presume you have supporters who can't go public with your support out of fear and intimidation. Could you discuss that?
No, I don't think I have supporters who can't go public. I would say I have supporters who don't do very much in the way of support, aside from verbal support. But I wouldn't say it's true. People are...
Could you discuss how much personal suffering and struggle it takes to make a stand like you for moral principles, what it costs?
There's no personal suffering. I mean, people have to have a sense of proportion. There's a large part of the world that lives at the edge of poverty, and there's a large part actually that lives beyond the edge of poverty. I have a roof over my head. I have hearty meals when I want them. And then there's a large part of the world where if you make the most elementary criticism of your government, pretty trivial things, you end up dead. You know, in my case, I lost my job, but in most parts of the world, not most, but large parts of the world, for demanding your most elementary human rights, you lose a body part. You lose your tongue, you lose your nose, you lose your ear, and then you lose your head and you lose your life. So you have to maintain a sense of proportion. And the great scheme of things, I've lived a very blessed life, and it's really, it would be the pinnacle of solipsism, self-absorption, for me to be talking about suffering. The average life expectancy in Africa is 46, so I'm 56, so I've lived already a decade more than I deserve by the standards of Africa.
How do you weigh your search for truth versus pragmatism? And I mean, how many bubbles can you pop before people, especially in the Jewish community, but not only, can't take it anymore? And I'm thinking perhaps your comments about Hezbollah and all that, what's your sense as you go through all this process?
I'm not out to antagonize anyone, but I'm also not going to, exercise self-censorship on issues which I think are critical. You know, when I supported Hezbollah, it was in Lebanon in July, August 2006, when Israel was annihilating the country. And there's no way. I think we're there, we're at 9:30. So let's just take this and one more question.
Okay, all right, thank you.
There is no way I'm going to be silent in the midst of that destruction and bloodletting in Lebanon. I was perfectly aware that there were going to be cameras at the march, that the axis of evil, the ADL and other organizations, were going to use what I said against me. But I have to weigh that against the fact that people were being killed. And I'm not going to be silent, and I absolutely did then, and I continue today. I support any people who are resisting foreign marauders, vandals, murderers, which is what Israel is doing in Lebanon, and which, in my opinion, they're going to be doing again pretty soon.
All right, last question, I guess, please. There's a Jewish anti-Zionist or whatever, there's a protester in Ann Arbor called Henry Herskowitz, and his, he leads a weekly vigil for 7 years. He calls it Jewish Witnesses for Peace and Friends outside a conservative synagogue in Ann Arbor. And his argument, and I'd like your take on it, please, is that the organized Jewish community today, including synagogues, cannot be separated from Zionism, and that the critic must actually confront the organized, quote, Jewish community. And so, not only the one term Zionist expressly. So where do you find that?
I have no interest in this kind of language, confronting Zionism. It doesn't mean anything to me. It's just gobbledygook. Let's just speak in a language which clarifies what are the issues. If you're opposed to certain policies that Israel is engaged in, then just state the policies. But not all of this, we have to confront Zionism, like Zionism is some sort of mythical monster, like some sort of chimera. You know, I find it all, it's rubbish, and I won't any longer. I mean, there was a time when I was tolerant of it, but now I find it kind of insidious, this kind of language and this kind of approach to it, because it's either sinister or it's meaningless. Whichever it is, sinister or meaningless, it's not my cup of tea. I have no interest whatsoever in Zionism. I came to the Israel-Palestine conflict relatively late in life. I was already in 1982, I was already 29 years old. I was involved mostly in anti-war activity, civil rights movement, and I came to Zionism relatively late in life. I should say I came to the Israel-Palestine conflict relatively late in life, and it had to do, or it grew out of my general humanist beliefs. It had nothing to do with some sort of fixation or obsession with Zionism. If the conflict had been resolved, I would have moved on. I would have looked elsewhere in the world where there was injustice, and I would have invested my energies and my time in trying to undo that injustice. Just as a youth, I was involved in the struggle against the war in Vietnam, like many other people, obviously. This focus on Zionism, it's kind of this Captain Ahab, Moby Dick kind of monomaniacal fixation, which I find, if I can say so, I find it slightly disturbed, and I don't want to get involved in it. And so confronting Zionism, and there are books overcoming Zionism, like you're supposed to lie on a couch with a therapist. I just find it all nonsense.